Are we willing to do what it takes to make our witness to the gospel as effective as possible? That's the question Paul asks today. And since Corinth was a place where athletics were an important part of life, it's no wonder he chooses a sporting analogy to drive home his point. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. In his ongoing discussion with the Corinthians regarding the burning question of eating meat sacrificed to idols, we've seen Paul make a very interesting argument. He agrees with the so-called stronger members that because there really are no other gods besides the God we know in Jesus Christ, eating meat sacrificed to idols does not, in fact, implicate them in worshiping those idols and the gods they represent. But that isn't the only relevant factor here. The fact is, others in the church are scandalized by their actions, and it is causing a rift in the church. Pointing to his own practice of not exercising his right to receive payment for his work, Paul insists that the right course of action sometimes is to let go of one's rights for the good of the whole. It was a tough sell then, even as it is a tough sell now. We cherish our rights, especially those under the law, and we guard them zealously. But Paul isn't asking us to give up our rights completely, but rather to consider when insisting on pressing our individual rights hurts the larger Christian community. This is not a question of subordinating our rights generally, but only within the church community. So having declared that he has given up his right to earn a living by receiving payment from the Corinthians for his work among them, Paul now asks a question we would also ask: what's in it for me? Paul's answer is as direct as it is disarming. He says, "What then is my reward? Just this, that in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them." For Paul, there is a more important issue at stake than merely making a living. The bigger issue was the spread of the Christian message. That is clearly his highest value, the one to which all other values must absolutely take a back seat, even to the extent of subordinating his own rights, his own advantage. Now, as he can do from time to time, Paul inserts what looks like a non sequitur into the conversation, an element that is interesting enough on its own, but doesn't seem at first glance to support his argument. Just let me read this short section, and let's see if we can make sense of it. He says, "Do you not know that in a race the runners all compete, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win it. Athletes exercise self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable one. So I do not run aimlessly, nor do I box as though beating the air, but I punish my body and enslave it, so that after proclaiming to others, I myself should not be disqualified." Why this analogy? Well, at one level, it's because Paul knows his audience well. Apparently, Corinth was the location of an every other year athletic competition, sort of like an every 2-year regional Olympics. The games had only recently returned to Corinth after a nearly 100-year absence, so the church in Corinth would have understood this analogy from the world of sports very well. Okay, so that explains why he might have used an athletic analogy, but how does it inform his argument? In a nutshell, training for an athletic competition is all about subordinating everything else in one's life to the greater goal of winning a competition. My brother-in-law, Tony, was a member of the 1976 U.S. Olympic team in Quebec, Canada. He was a rower, and he'd rowed in international competitions even during his college days. After he graduated college in 1972 and served as a backup but didn't see action at the Munich Games, he dedicated the next 4 years of his life to training for the '76 Games. He put off graduate school, lived in shared quarters with his teammates much of the time, and didn't make a whole lot of money. He did find time to marry my sister somewhere in there, but even then, he worked jobs well below his skill level so he could train as many hours a day as possible. That is all to say, Tony subordinated nearly everything else in life to the larger goal of making the Olympic team and winning a medal. Unfortunately, an untimely mistake in the semifinal heat took his boat out of contention, but I saw at pretty close hand what it took to even make that team. Paul's point to the Corinthians is that if they are serious about the gospel and its spread, they have to treat it like an athletic event, where they subordinate their own needs and even their own rights to the greater good of the gospel. As I said earlier, it isn't immediately obvious why he suddenly turns to this analogy, because he neither introduces it nor concludes it by making his point clear. But it turns out to be a pretty good analogy for the church anyway. If we want to be the people and the church that God has called us to be collectively, it requires self-sacrifice on our part. That's not so hard to understand. When we return tomorrow, Paul gives the Corinthians a warning about not taking their place in the kingdom for granted. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.